Hello, good morning. Hi,
Hi.
Angarika. How are you doing?
I'm good. I just realized I've not seen you in a really long time. So it's odd
Yes,
to suddenly see you behind a screen.
yes, and then seeing each other on Zoom when
On
actually we
Zoom.
might have
Yeah.
been able to meet in person. But yeah, it's one thing about today is, doesn't it feel really nice to be doing a conversation in the morning on?
Did I lose you or is it my internet? Hello? Am I audible? Was it
It,
you or was it me?
it was me. It was me. So we were just briefed about our internet connections and on cue.
There it goes. Yeah.
There it went, but I'm back. I'm back. So I am really excited to have this conversation with you today. And when Bronwyn spoke to me about troublemaking, you came to mind. so, so
I'm not
and I
sure what to
realized
make of that.
So I thought it would be fun to have a conversation that we might have had maybe over a coffee, just for a lot of people
Yeah.
around the world to see. No pressure. Um, so I'm gonna jump right in, Angarika, because I think today, obviously we're talking about collectives, we're talking about unions, we're talking about all of those groups that don't really fit into defined organizations and institutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're involved with Maraa Collective. And I would love it if you could tell us a bit more about Maraa and what you do. And yeah, take it away. Tell us more.
Yeah, sure. Whenever somebody asks us what Maraa is, it's always really difficult to kind of find a concise way of talking about it. And I think that's sort of also part of the politics of how we came together, because we've tried really hard to not be an issue specific organization. So it's not so easy to say that we work on, say, women or health or gender, but rather, I guess the clearest way to articulate what we do is that we're an arts and media collective. And Maraa is not an abbreviation, because that's another question we get asked a lot. But in the local language over here in Kannada, it means tree. And I think the metaphor of a tree is really intrinsic to the way in which we work, because it is about growth and it is about flowering, but it's also about decay. It's also about things falling off. It's also about being rooted, but also kind of reaching out in different directions. And that's something that we draw a lot of inspiration from. But I mean, just in a couple of lines, we are a very small collective. We're just 6 to 7 people. And we work through the arts and through community media to foreground experiences and narratives that we feel are censored, are suppressed, and are neglected. So really trying to open up political imaginations through rediscoveries of history, through supporting independent arts practice, through promoting community media. So that's kind of what we do, and that usually ends up being at the intersection of gender, labor, and caste, particularly in the context of India. But yeah, that's sort of who we are, and I guess we can talk more as we go along.
Nice.
And is there a lag?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, never mind. Let's just ignore it and go on.
Yeah, so I think when we talk, what comes to mind, so we're talking, I mean, the title of the talk is Unregistered Collectives, right? And when we were thinking about what to call it, we were trying to figure out what it was. One of the words was formal and informal, and what sat with me a little bit uncomfortably about calling formal and informal is that how do you qualify whether something is formal or informal?
Yeah,
But when you talk about funding, because we're talking about resourcing and how to move money to places where change is happening, I guess the simplest way to talk about it was unregistered, but I know that Maraa is registered but works with a number of different unregistered groups, formally unregistered. And like I myself am not, I don't work for a collective, like full disclosure. I've worked with a number of collectives, and one of the things that kept hitting me was about how much amazing work was being done like outside of the traditional structures of what we consider, change and outcomes and outputs and all of these things that we define and we've come to define in the formal resourcing ecosystem. And that's why I thought it would be really interesting to talk about what they are and how we need to think about them much more intentionally, especially when it comes to resourcing, and especially now. Like, I mean, we're both in India, so we know what's happening here. And, it's not, we grew up in this civil society movement, and we just in our own activist lives, we've seen the change in how the political, socio-political environment is. So, yeah, it just really struck me about the importance of talking about collectives, and then also, obviously, not probably looked at, but also something that needs to get more attention is, formalized organizing, like unions and labor organizing.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's also like a bit of a question is what is a collective? In the sense of, I suppose, one way to look at it would be the structure. And I think something that I found in most collectives that I've interacted with is that they're often horizontally structured. And that's something that, I mean, we've really tried to do as well, which is that we found that a lot of traditional development agencies had a lot of internal hierarchies. And I think that happens because in order to get funding, you have to look at your work mainly as projects. And I think when projects start defining the imagination of work, then everything becomes a target or a timeline. And that begins to mirror in the internal workings of the organization as well. So I think one thing has definitely been to kind of try and see if we can visualize the model of working differently. And it's not that it's not that we're 100% successful. We find ourselves falling into the same traps as well, but it's something that we've tried to really feed into our working mechanisms to ensure that things are more process driven rather than kind of locked into project frameworks, because this is something that we've been talking recently to a lot of older feminist organizations, and something that we found, which is so curious, is that somehow over the years, probably also because of a certain kind of saturation and exhaustion, things have gotten, like life itself has gotten locked into, certain ways of thinking and seeing, and it's really difficult to then bring yourself out of that. So in a given organization, there will be, say, a program on women and children, and then a separate program with men and boys. And that's not really how life works. So I guess one thing would definitely be the ways of working. And I think another thing that I've come across is that there's not that much, there might be some questions raised on scale. I mean, usually I think when we think of change, we think of scale and we think of large numbers, and that does have a value. There is value in that, but I found with a lot of collectives, and this also, of course, links to resourcing, but I think it's also a political conscious choice to not work only in terms of quantity and scale, but also to think about what it means to work, for example, hyperlocally, or what it means to go in depth and stay with something for a longer period of time, and what that would look like. And I was wondering, like, because you've also worked on the other end of things in terms of supporting a lot of feminist collectives. So what are some of the kind of imaginations of collectives that you've come across in your work?
I think one of the other things, like to add to what you said, is around those sort of shared, I mean, I think organizations also make their own shared values and principles, but I do think because of like what you talked about, the structure of how things are, the ability to keep coming back to those values and principles and those sort of, core, what we agree on as equals, and how we, distribute resources within. I know Maraa, for example, distributes resources equally amongst members of the collective, and that's really kind of, I mean, that shows a lot about how those values and principles play. Because I think, I mean, one can also say organizations can also, you know, feel like collectives also. You could register, and I mean, you'll eventually you might have to also do that. But I think also I've seen the ability to be able to contribute to something collectively, but also, you know, have space to develop your own politics and your own way of, you know, your own sort of, you know, what you're passionate about, and how that individual sort of, you know, feeds into the collective. You know, working with, I mean, one of the collectives I worked with recently for a comics anthology was a Kadak collective, a group of South Asian artists who came together quite organically, both in India and in the diaspora. And they just started realizing that as an individual artist, the way to sort of, you know, get visible, also being South Asian, brown, marginalized from different identities, it was difficult to, and in the sort of mainstream art world, to sort of, you know, get noticed. And the way to also come together, share creative practice, share the experience of maybe multiple marginalizations that people were facing. And the other thing was also, you know, sharing networks and sharing access that you often don't have access to if you're either, you know, I guess it's different when you're a member of a collective and you're a member of, or an employee of an organization. Those kind of things are separate. So I think flexibility, that kind of shared value, felt like really important to me also when I started, you know, working with. And I think something for funders actually to keep in mind, that's what really struck me. Not so much that we don't understand what collectives are or what organized, you know, non-organizational collectives are, but that's what makes it quite powerful, like setting your agendas and being able to respond to current moments as well. That's something that I really felt was quite important.
I mean, that was something that we were discussing recently in, we had like a reflections meeting, and we were talking about, is a collective a sum total of the individuals in it, or is a collective that's something that kind of has its own entity, and then there are individuals as well, but it also carries its own history, it has its own body. And because Maraa has been around now for 14 years, so in a lot of people's eyes, we would perhaps come across, even though we articulate ourselves as a collective, for some people perhaps we come across as more of an organization. We're definitely, I mean, it was so funny because earlier we were eligible for a lot of grants that would support young feminists, but it seems that we are no longer young feminists. So we were just kind of reckoning with, I mean, what it means also to be around for a certain period of time, because while Maraa has kind of maintained that it's shaped by the politics and ideas of the individuals in it, I think after a certain period of time, the collective itself also carries a history, and new individuals who are entering also have, I suppose, some amount of responsibility in terms of carrying that identity with care, even if you might choose to change it or question it or challenge it. And I think that's something that we've really sort of, I mean, it makes our working process very slow, but I think something that we've really kind of prioritized is a culture of debate and discussion, because until everybody's kind of on a consensus, or unless somebody's ceded ground, things don't really move. But in that hashing and rehashing is, I think, where politics are kind of is kind of shaped, and I think that also helps us in not getting stuck in looking at things in a particular way. So, I mean, that was just a set of reflections that came to mind in light of what we're discussing today.
You know, when you said that about the young feminist collectives, right? Because when you were younger and I was an advisor with the Frida Fund, and you know, Frida is probably one of the probably the most progressive funder of young feminist movements globally, if I could say, just in terms of the way they grew and started thinking about core flexible funding for, groups. But then it also made me think, as you kind of aged out of the young feminist movement, that why is that core flexible? Like, it's only like that assumption that only younger feminists are going to be doing unregistered, kind of small cottage industry type like organizing because they don't have access to funding. And then the moment you get older and you kind of know the system, that you can suddenly access funding. And I think one of the gaps there is that how are we thinking, even if we're saying, even if, feminist funders are really offering those core funding to groups, there are still so many other challenges around, moving money around. But then also there's a very value that it's, also recognizing that how we see issues as a continuum, how do we continue to nurture collectives and not sort of push them in directions that sometimes funding can do. So also the collective recognizing their own politics and keep coming back to it and sort of recognizing, how much resources do we actually need? Who do we want to resource us? Like those kind of questions have come up quite like a lot in my work. And I was wondering if we could then kind of shift a little bit of our conversation into resourcing itself, because I know resourcing is a huge issue. And I wonder if you can tell us about your experience with Maraa and the American furniture company. By the way, I haven't heard this story. So I'm really curious to hear your story of resourcing, not from like any I guess traditional funder or rights-based funder, but tell me about the American furniture company and Maraa.
I was actually, the thing is something I was also talking about with Braun and Annalise earlier, is that in Maraa, we've kind of tried to keep certain amount of our work non-funded intentionally, because, and that's particularly, I think, our arts work, because the formal art sector and the way that it works in India will not have a place for the kind of work that we're trying to do. We find it quite hierarchical and quite exclusionary. And our arts work is really about challenging the models as much in the arts sector as it is in civil society. And it's like a perennial joke at Maraa that all our activist friends think we're too artistic and all our artistic friends think we're too activisty. So it's like impossible to find like some kind of ground where you can actually talk about aesthetics politically and also talk about the aesthetics of politics. This doesn't seem to kind of exist much. But what happened was that we run an annual arts festival. We've been running it for the last 14 years, and usually it's crowdfunded. So we've kind of like stayed away from ever actually approaching anybody for funding, because we felt that the articulations were not meeting the spirit of the jam. And then suddenly out of the blue, this is I think 2015, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, a lot of our work was centered on public space and kind of using public space for artistic expression. And I think our articulation of what public space means has also grown over the years. But at that time, I think we had this slightly naive or optimistic idea that if you hosted events in public space, it would automatically lead to dialogue. But of course, I think over the years now, the inherent violence in public space is something that we're focusing on a lot more. But at that time, we were, very open to kind of thinking about how space and form interact with each other. And I guess this company, they're called Herman Miller. And Herman Miller, turns out, is a really famous architect and furniture designer a long time ago. And he was really interested in designing furniture for public space and also thinking about how office and co-working spaces need not be so formal. And he really felt that the aesthetics of furniture would in turn influence working cultures. So I suppose that they found a fit somehow with the work that we were doing, and they wrote to us, and we actually had a really wonderful relationship with them, because the person who was in charge, they have an India office, so the person who was in charge kind of really made an effort to understand what we were trying to do, because initially when they approached us, we were really wary. particularly about taking corporate funding. But they didn't want any branding, which was, I think, tick mark number one. And the second was that they just kind of gave us a certain amount of support and said that, I mean, other than reporting mechanisms, you can really choose to do what you'd like with it. And for us, that was really refreshing because it gave us a chance to kind of articulate and express our work on our own terms. And yeah, like you said, bizarre, because not necessarily like the conventional places where one would find funding. But I think that's something that kind of, just to answer like what you were talking about earlier in terms of resourcing, is something that I think is really crucial for collectives, which is to not necessarily always think that the money is going to come from traditional sources. And I think a lot of that from the practitioner's point of view depends on how many different ways in which are you able to see your work and articulate your work. And so it's not necessary. Like I remember when we were working with community radio, we wanted to apply for a grant around gender, and a lot of the gender grants at that time were just not able to understand why community radio practitioners would be applying for a gender grant. Whereas actually 90% of their broadcasts were around gender and farming, gender and health, but it's not a traditional kind of imagination of a group that would apply for a gender grant. Likewise with arts grants, though now I feel it's changing because I think the current political moment and the way in which identity politics has asserted itself, I think there are people who are making an effort to bridge these worlds. But I think a lot of it really depends on how you're able to see your own work. And the more agile and dynamic you are in that, the more likely you're able to resource yourself in different ways. I mean, a question that we keep asking ourselves is also like, where is capital important, and where can one think about other kinds of strategies? So we're hardcore believers in in-kind support. So people who can give us space, can give us food, can give us train tickets. I mean, that side of things, I think, I mean, in India, there's a concept called jugaad, which is basically, I suppose, how do you translate jugaad?
There's a whole book about it, by the way. There's someone wrote a book about it.
I guess like thinking on your feet and making things work. And that's something that I think is really important, because otherwise it just gets too straitjacketed. Not to say that money and funding is not important, it is. But I think there are also other ways in which one can think about what resourcing work means. Yeah, but it would be good also to hear from you about, because you're on the other side of the fence now.
No, I'm not. Actually, interesting that you say that, because we took different paths, and like we've known each other for the last 10 years.
A long time,
yeah. And you joined Maraa at a time where I was sort of entering the formalized, human rights, gender justice space, always worked in institutions and organizations, but interestingly never worked for a funder, by the way. Still haven't gone into the, but a lot of people who are working with movements like you assume that I am working with funding, because I think one of the roles that I try and fulfill is just being a linkage, because I kind of understand a little bit more than most folks in movements, the ways in which money moves, and that's as a result of either working with funders, advising funders, and I realized that it's a complex space, and a lot of the time it's really you see the end result, which is looking at the applications or the funding cycles, and there are so many people thinking about how to do this, when to put calls out, who it should reach to, and so I always think about this articulation that you're sharing, like the example of Herman Miller and how sometimes money resourcing is needed at times when it's unexpected, and also like at times where ideas come to fruition and groups want to work on things that may not be urgent in terms of crisis or crisis response, but are sort of like needed in this political moment. So my work with Khadak was that. Like it had been many years where we in India have been governed by this right-wing, I mean, fascist government, and people were across the world were sort of reacting to what this moment was, and the bystander anthology was a result of that. And interestingly, I was part of a six-member editorial team who were bringing together 50 artists. And so I joined the team sort of early, like after the conceptualization, when we started working through Artists Would Be, etc. And I remember, because I come from this space where I, work with funders, maybe work with different organizations, I thought, oh, okay, this is a really great idea and it should really be resourced. And I tried. No lack of trying. Like, I have access, more access than most. And it just really struck me. And I remember telling the other members of the editorial, like, I was a non-believer that we would be able to raise funding. It was an ambitious funding target. And it was based on politics, like paying everyone equitably, making sure all the artists were paid an international fee, because, international comic books, there's a whole level of funding there, and there's a lot of, there's also issues of race, because you don't see a lot of South Asian creators in that space. And we crowdfunded. I have to say, one feminist organization, not even a funder, supported us in the anthology point of view. Shout out to you. But we also had Chumbak, which is, it's a brand, but they didn't want anything from us. And it felt so good. Sometimes it feels so good when people who you don't expect to find your work, find any relation to your work interesting. It's very, very heartening, I have to say, especially to see that kind of support. And, we didn't get support. We crowdfunded the whole thing on Kickstarter, the entire project. And it made me also think about the broader funding ecosystem. It's great that we funded it on Kickstarter, but there's also a structure, a system of inequalities when it comes to funding. And we see how much funding there is around. And, collectives, and also I would also say unions, for example, like women-led unions now. I'm seeing so many amazing women-led unions. We shouldn't have to struggle so much. That's my kind of observation, is that why is it such a heavy lift? And of course there are a number of reasons, but I guess because I don't work for a funder, I don't know, but I just keep thinking it shouldn't have to be this hard. It shouldn't have to be this hard for those of us who really believe that resources should be redistributed. How can we radically imagine that happening, and especially in a difficult environment? This is not an easy environment, but how can we begin to start imagining that? So not a good question.
I mean, what you mentioned about kind of being a link or a bridge, I feel like is so important, because most of the time there are groups that, I guess, is there music playing for you?
It is. Kind of
groovy. Maybe that's a sign for us to begin wrapping up slowly. But what I was saying was that there's so many groups that we've come across that who really are doing such radical work in really local contexts. I mean, definitely there's no access to English or, capital in that sense, but really require the support. And that's something that we have also from the funding universe been lucky to meet a few people who work in really large organizations, but have been really supportive in terms of finding a way to make it happen. I think a lot of that is political will. And if you have that, you will move the bureaucracy and you will move the paper and it'll happen. And it's a really important role to play. And it's something that we've kind of been thinking about as well, now that we're not really starting out anymore, about how we can kind of play that role for smaller collectives as well, in terms of having been through that same journey and also knowing what one has to guard against, because it's so easy to get co-opted. It's easy for your work to get appropriated. You probably don't have checks and balances in place to prevent that, because you don't even know what what it might mean. So something that we've been actually thinking about is how to organize more conversations between collectives. And this need not be, for example, only feminist, only gender-based collectives or anything like that, but arts collectives and trying to kind of have conversations on models, because something that we've come across is that there are a number of different models. So some people, for example, don't put any funding pressure on the collective. So all members of the collective will do part-time work wherever it is. And the collective is something that runs in off time and is kind of free from all of those pressures. Other people can model music again. Other people kind of have a 50-50 model, and others like Maraa, for example, we all work full time. And as Gopika mentioned, we do, whether you joined 10 years ago, whether you joined a year ago, everybody in Maraa gets paid equally, because I think that's something that often causes a hierarchy. So I think one thing that would be really interesting to do, particularly in the context of the subcontinent, would be to organize more conversations where collectives can kind of share with one another as to where they are in that journey and how they've thought through this kind of intersection of politics, structure, and the form in which they work.
That's so interesting. I feel like someone should fund it. Not trying to be ironic here, but what I'm also thinking, like, and that sounds amazing. And actually, having worked with collectives, but also, right now I'm sharing space, like physical space, with a collective, Kaniki collective of artists and photographers, and they've also been having conversations about just questions you may have about what does it mean to be a collective today. And so I feel like that kind of conversation would be great. And part of that, can I just make a pitch to you, is also talk about funding and also think about how you can be propositional, because progressive funders are there. And it's really about the balance of how, of course, taking or receiving funding is a political choice at the end of the day. But I also think about those who don't even have that choice, right? Who don't even have the ability to choose, should we take money or not? And I mean, the unions that I've interacted with, particularly in Bangalore, like the Garment Labor Union, the choice is not there. Livelihood, working in a union, also collecting membership from workers and things like that. So, and also a lot of informal collectives who never have the opportunity to give their whole lives to this work, even though that may be what they want. And so, while I think moving into like advice for collectives and groups, I think that was what we wanted to discuss, in the last segment of this. I think like being clear, like I would say to you, because I feel like I'm also talking from a what would be great kind of perspective, is sort of seeing, is sort of articulating to funders and funder allies as well, where resourcing can play a role. I think you mentioned this earlier, and where, what kind of work and what kind of activities will be ring-fenced away, and funders have to be okay with that. Like, they have to be okay with funding a part of your work and you going off and doing something, without funding and without any resourcing system. I mean, you did a fantastic project with a trans rights group called Truth's Dream, which was crowdfunded again. A beautiful project, and you can I'd love it if you shared a little bit about it as well. And it made me think, wow, this would never have gotten funded, but it could have. Like, I was like, oh, this is just such a beautiful coming together of activists and artists. And so, I think that political articulation would be good.
Actually, True Dream did get, partially funded, and that's what I meant by organizations who are kind of, larger funding organizations who have been really supportive. So we did get some amount of support from Fund for Global Human Rights and from the Human Capability Foundation. But yes, a large percentage of it was crowdfunded. And I think that was important in the context of this project to also show community ownership and kind of support for work like this. But I mean, very briefly, Truth Dream was a photo exhibition, which was actually conceptualized by Chandni, who is a very senior transgender activist in Bangalore, and she runs an organization called Payana. And she wanted to bring together trans women and trans men who are above the age of 50, and specifically talk about what beauty and fantasy and aging means. And they wanted to sort of step into dream sequences and dreamscapes, which they were never able to realize in reality because of the history of the community is marked by begging and sex work, and there's violence and exploitation on a daily basis. But this was really a space in which they could explore fantasies. And so they got in touch with us and they said, I remember she called us and she said, our only caveat is that we kind of had to put the whole thing together from scratch. There was a cultural performance. They all wanted to
I'm having trouble hearing you.
dress as old Kannada and Tamil film actresses and mythological characters. And the details of that are there on our Facebook page and our Instagram page if any of you want to look at have a closer look. But it's interesting that you brought that up, because I was just thinking about how some organizations who we know who are much older, like older feminist organizations, older trans rights organizations, are now going through a complete sort of, how do I say, like a reconfiguration. And it links back to what you were saying earlier about why we expect that it's only younger feminists who are doing cutting edge work, because a lot of the older generation that we're meeting are so disillusioned with the ways in which they've been caught by certain structures that they've worked in. And I find that there are a lot of collectives forming, they're in their 50s and 60s, and they're choosing to leave organizations and form their own collectives and finally have freedom and flexibility to do the work that they want to do. So it's really interesting to also plot that graph. And I think another thing that's really missing is intergenerational conversations around this. Even within the feminist movement, very tough to have a conversation with older feminists and younger feminists in the same room. And I find both sides are closed. And it's really, that's another thing that I think really needs to be, some space needs to be found for that. In order to also talk about how feminist movements can be restructured and supported and sustained, particularly in times like this, where, it's not just India, it's the story of, I think, a majority of countries in the world right now that we are facing fascist and authoritarian regimes, and there is a direct impact on social movements, on activists. There's killings, there's arrests, so there's actually a lot of things to reckon with. So if there were ways to kind of come together and share also how to work smartly and strategically, because there's no point in being confrontational, there's no point in getting arrested. So how do you kind of do your work in a way that allows you to sustain and not burn out? We're finding that a lot of people are facing that kind of psychic toll, particularly after COVID. I'm pretty sure it's something you've come across as well, because you also work in a larger context than us in terms of South Asia and how people are kind of trying to hold things together.
Yeah, it feels like things are together somehow, but also falling apart. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so it does feel like we're at this moment of really the need to, I think we really need each other the most right now.
Yeah.
You know? It feels like we're in that moment. So we have only a couple of minutes left. And I wanted to make one last point about, we talked about collectives, we talked about funders, but also the role of registered organizations and registered NGOs. Like in India right now, we are facing quite a difficult scenario where funding is really tight domestically. There's not a lot of progressive, big funding that needs to be there for our social movements. Yeah. And global funding is tightened because of legal and fiscal regimes that are, pretty much draconian in nature. And so I also feel the need for, the more traditional NGOs, those have been around who have, succeeded in building their organizations and their structures on the funding that was coming in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, like the need for them to also step up and the need for them to also think about how are they supporting collectives and how are they also being more political, not just in the activism that they do, but ensuring that we continue to have diverse social movements. We continue to have movements that aren't, because we're going to be in a place in 10 years if we don't do this where there's no voices of dissent, and the ones that exist are probably the only ones that manage to survive, you know. So I don't know if you have any closing thoughts as well in terms of advice to organizations, funders.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there is a lot of gatekeeping, which is very frustrating. And I think that there has to be a way in which we reimagine what support and what nurturing like a second line of leadership means. Also keeping in mind that probably the time in which politics and ideas and imaginations of politics was formed in the 80s and 90s, we live in a completely different world now. I mean, there's no point in even making a binary between virtual and offline, you know, in certain cases. That's just one example. But I think there is a need in which people, there is a lot to learn from the older generation. And I do feel that consistency, commitment, patience, I think are values that a lot of younger groups could do with. But at the same time, I feel, God, I feel very old suddenly. But at the same time, I feel it's necessary for older models to open themselves up. And I feel like there's growing frustration even within organizational kind of structures about the fact that, it's small things like leadership of organizations is still male dominated. It's still older men. At most you will get to a program manager post and that's it. So this kind of binary between who is conceptualizing and who is implementing, for example, is one big thing. So definitely, I think more spaces for that. And also, I think on thinking about resourcing innovatively, because I feel people often get discouraged because they feel that if you put your eggs in like one or two baskets, it's probably not going to yield much, particularly right now. So how to kind of think about the different ways in which your work could be supported monetarily, in kind, and what that means in terms of where it's, I feel like for a big question is the audiences that you want to reach. Who is this work for, and where is it located, and how sensitive are you to the ecologies within which you're working? If you're going to get a grant for like tens and hundreds of lakhs and you're working in an economic context where people are barely making minimum wage, it doesn't make much sense because you're just going to create a structure of dependency in that context. So I think just kind of keeping some of these things in mind, we could probably go on and on. But so I guess I don't have closing thoughts, just.
That's fine. We still have some time to talk with the audience, but yeah, I wonder if we can do that now. So because we could probably talk all day about this. So I see Bronwyn. Hey, Bronwyn.
Hi. Yeah, I think we could talk all day, and we do have a bit more time to talk with all of the amazing people who've joined us here and have been listening to your conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all of your insights. I'm going to invite people to do a silent round of applause. I just loved the thread throughout that conversation around imagination. And you said, Angarika, about how collectives, it's sort of limited by how dynamic and agile you can be in imagining who you are in terms of where you seek resourcing. I think that also applies to donors and sort of intermediary organizations like mine, IWDA, those bridge builders that you were talking about. We need to expand our imaginations on who's out there doing this kind of political work, and go and expose ourselves to the kinds of creative, imaginative, the multitude of different ways that things are being changed out there that don't just look like a cookie cutter NGO, which is the type of organization which is easy and standard to fund. So